Welcome, everyone. This is our third in a series of conversations about race, our third and final series. And I'm Betty Casey. I'm editor of TulsaKids Magazine. We've partnered with OSU-Tulsa and the Tri-City Collective to bring these conversations to you. And I want to thank everyone for being part of this before we get started. Our moderator and esteemed guest is Quraysh Ali Lansana. He is a artist fellow in Tulsa. He is also an adjunct professor at OSU-Tulsa. He's taught at Juilliard. He he's a poet, an author, an educator, and has a long list of accomplishments. So I want to welcome Quraysh today, and I want to remind everyone that they can chat live with us. So if you have questions or comments you want to make along the way, I hope that you'll feel all right to do that, and I'll bring those up as we go through. I also want to mention that we have some questions from previous weeks that we feel we need to explore a little further. So we're going to do that. This week's topic is resources. So we have a list of resources available on the TulsaKids website, and we want to keep adding to that. So we want this conversation to continue, and we want to continue to educate ourselves. So I want to start, Quraysh, today with a question that a parent brought up last week, where her middle daughter stood up she felt like she was standing up for her classmates who were maybe being maligned, and she was told by these classmates that maybe she shouldn't stand up for them. They didn't need her to do that. And so there was a little confusion because the mom was saying, stand up when you hear something wrong, and the little girl was disappointed in what happened with her. So I know that even happens with adults. So is there a good and bad way to be an ally? How do we speak up?
Well, first of all, it's good to see you again, Betty, and it's thank you all for tuning in for these conversations. I had a one-on-one conversation with that particular parent, and she explained a little more with a little more detail than she could provide on our chat. So I'll tell you sort of very briefly that, it's a very interesting situation that her daughter found herself in. So the parent who sent that information or asked that question, a white parent, a white mother, has been raising her children to be very conscious, woke, as the young people would say these days, and has taught her children, and most specifically in this case her daughter, about the N-word, and about how that is not a word that she should ever use, and that in her mind it's a word that no one should ever use. So the scenario that occurred is that this young woman overheard two young Black men at her school calling one another using the N-word. And the young white woman went up to them and said, "Stop, you should stop using that word." And the young men said, "Well, who are you to tell us that we can't use this word?" Essentially, long story short. And so it brought up another very interesting, historically rooted, very long conundrum, right, about the use of the N-word. And so, there are older generations of folks who just believe the word should not be used at all. The word means what it means. It's rooted in the transatlantic trading of Africans and chattel enslavement of Africans. Remembering that the folks who were captured in the west coast of Africa spoke probably 1,000 different languages, and then were forced to learn English on the job in very, very harsh conditions, and were referred to with the N-word. So that's what white folks call them. That's what they started to call themselves. Again, very limited English, right? So And then you went through a moment in, of course, the 60s, from the N-word to Negro in terms of self-referential, in terms of Black folks, to Black, and then to African American. Jesse Jackson really forwarded that self-identifier for Black folks or folks of African descent in this country. And so, but what has happened throughout all of that time is that there's always been a subculture, or I won't say subculture, but an undercurrent of people of Black folks using that word to refer to one another, right? Never, of course, has there been a time when it's been okay for a white person to call a Black person the N-word. Not 100 years ago and not now. It's never been okay. But what has happened, and I think, is that maybe a couple of generations ago, that word was sort of reappropriated and sort of re-mainstreamed in a way, in large part to do with rap culture. And so, there was a time 20 some odd years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when Oprah was like, no one should use that word, and they got a lot of headlines and such. But there was even a time when Richard Pryor went to Africa and came back and said, I'll never use the comedian Richard Pryor went to Africa, came back and said, we're all African, I'm never using that word again. But then at the same time, there were some folks, Black folks, who still continue to use that word, and reappropriating the word to also sort of flip the empowerment of that word, right? To take it away, to dilute its power from its history and from the white American sort of contextual standpoint, and flip it and make it, you my brother. It's a familial word, right? And then we'll say with the advent of rap culture, hip hop, not even hip hop, but rap culture, that now young people use that word, probably in the last 40, 50 years so now, use that word much more casually. Again, it's familial. It's a form of a bond, if you will, bonding in a word. To the point, actually, where I've actually come across young white men referring to themselves as using the N-word, right? Which is nuts, but it's true. But that also has a lot to do with sort of the mainstreaming of rap culture. But it would still never be okay unless the white homeboy and the Black or Latinx homeboy were really close, very, very, very tight, right? That it would be okay for the white boy to call one of them the N-word, right? And so it is an interesting conundrum that this young woman found herself in, because she was taught, right, that's not a word that you use. And then she went and attempted to sort of set straight two young Black men who felt a cultural empowerment and a cultural, a cultural sort of responsibility, or to a cultural acceptability, that's what I'm looking for, that is okay for them to use the word and to call themselves that. And it's really fascinating when we think about how that word and the B word, right, have been in many ways repurposed and redefined by youth culture of the last 20, 30 years, again, largely to do with the mainstreaming of rap culture. But it brings to mind, going directly to your question, right? She thought she was doing the right thing based on the way she's been taught. And she's not wrong about having concerns about the use of that word. She did overstep about sort of an unknown, or not necessarily unknown, I guess maybe at her age, perhaps unknown. But she did sort of overstep an invisible boundary that crosses the line that speaks to your question, right? She thought she was being an ally. She thought she was doing the right thing, but she also sort of tripped the cultural tripwire, right? That says, in some crazy way, right? It's not really crazy, but in a way that Black folks can use that word and white folks can't. Its meaning is the same, right? Slightly, right? But still, she crossed the boundary, and then she was upset about it. But what I think is that she learned something very valuable here. Again, speaking directly to your question about what it is to be an ally, what it is to be. I like the word accomplice that my friend and educator Josh Wan coined, right? Being a white accomplice, and that is number one, to be aware and have the knowledge of what it is you are fighting for, right? And some of that knowledge is more obvious, like, because we all saw the murder of George Floyd. We all saw the murder of Breonna Taylor, whose murderers are still yet to even be charged or arrested. We've all seen the murder of Terrence Crutcher, and so on and so forth. So those are things that we see, that folks know that's not right. But what's at the core of those things, right, is not always as visible, right? And so, for example, right, and I was just reading again from a really marvelous book named From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which I would recommend for parents as well, by Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. And she references, she's at Princeton, and she references that so when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot him in the middle of the street, didn't know that he had been in a store and had been accused of stealing cigars. Didn't know that when he was killed. But when that grainy video came out after his death, then that somehow justified his murder, right? That, oh, okay, so he's got a small record, or he's he stole some cigars from the store. That somehow says, okay, that Black person was a criminal, so it's okay that he's dead, though he was unarmed, right? And didn't have to be killed. But there's this notion of we've been talking a bit about white supremacy, but there's also, we haven't talked much about the flip side of that, really, which is the idea of Black inferiority, right? And though I say flip side, they're really right next to one another, right? And this idea that is as old as this nation, as Dr. Taylor puts it, that this idea of Black inferiority or Black inequality is somehow a justifiable reason for enslaving us, right? For poverty and many other things. And so, allies or accomplices need to have an understanding of at least to a degree, of the historical context in which this struggle continues and has continued for centuries now. And that, again, we see in the news as of late, young students across the country demanding Black history be taught in their K-12 and in their high school education systems. And yeah, right? So yeah, of course, it should not be an elective. I think we talked about that in our first session. It shouldn't be an elective. It should be required that folks understand and are taught African American history and Hispanic American history and Chinese American history and so on and so forth, because you're not going to really have an understanding of why it is that it's so traumatic and so ridiculously unnecessary that George Floyd and others were killed in the manner in which they were, if you don't understand, or at least have a basic understanding. You don't have to be a historian like I am, but have a basic understanding of the history of the systemic racism, the history of the nation in which this environment, in which something like those murders could happen. So that's one, right? And that knowledge, again, can come from many places, but it should definitely be coming from our high school textbooks for sure. How else are students going to get it?
Right.
Well, and then
go ahead. It becomes a part of us if we're taught through the lens of white culture, white superiority, white privilege. It not only becomes a part of who we are as white people, but a part of everyone else. So,
that's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
It's difficult to see outside of that bubble for anyone unless you have that historical context that you're talking about.
Right. And again, where are all of our children, Black, white, Latinx, what have you? Where are they going to acquire this, and where and how are they going to acquire this knowledge if it's not in schools, if it's not taught in schools, right? So, and we have plenty of amazing resources on the TulsaKids websites for parents to go to in our toolkit. But for our young people, right, if they're not going to learn it in school, where and in a place like Tulsa, where you can experience really great segregation in terms of there are all Black children with, schools with mostly all Black children on the north side, and schools on the south side that are mostly all Caucasian. So how are you going to, so that means that there's very, like we talked about before, that there's in many ways, limited interaction on a regular basis. So you're not going to learn it that way. So how are you going to learn it, right? You're going to learn it from the evening news, which we talked about before, which has its own biases. Or you're going to go come up to the north side and hang out and learn and meet somebody and talk to someone. You're going to read it in a book, right? And so that again speaks to, again, some of the resources that we have on the website, again, about introducing other cultures to introducing your children to other cultures, right? By using positive media, by books, by documentary films, or even movies, right? But that introduction early and often is important for all of our young people, regardless of ethnicity, to feel empowered and feel included. And so, all right, so ally lesson number one, right, is to have some knowledge from which you are, from which you are working, right? And then, I believe, and this is number two, I believe that the greatest character trait that anyone can possess is the ability to listen. And I believe that listening has become a lost art, particularly in this age of social media and people walking down the street like this with a cell phone. I believe that listening's become a very, very lost art. And we're also so polarized in this country now, and have been for a while, that if someone doesn't agree with us, we block them. We block them on Facebook, we block them out of our lives, we block them on Snapchat or IG or whatever. We just, as opposed to being able to listen to one another and learning to respectfully disagree. But allies need to be able to listen, and to be able to listen and learn from others, including folks who look like them as well, but be able to listen and learn from folks to have a deeper understanding, again, of why they are engaged in whatever work in which they're engaged, and to continue and remember that. It's interesting, Betty. I know we talked about this before. It's interesting because there are so many white allies involved in protests. I mean, most of the protests in Portland that have been going on 80 days now are largely white allies, and now white moms and dads, right? Largely. And that is a remarkable thing. But at the same time, it is also important that these allies remember why they're there and who they're putting their lives on the line for, in the front lines with leaf blowers and locked arms. Why are they there?
Right. Which
Whose
goes,
lives are,
yeah,
go
which
ahead.
well, it goes to your comment about understanding context, understanding history, and not just our own history, but everyone's views.
Right.
But I think without context, if you're going to a protest, you're sort of on a superficial level. You're at a level of not that you shouldn't, but
Right. Of course.
people to talk to. Absolutely, we all need to stand up for fairness and equality and the murder of people like George Floyd. But the reason I really wanted to have you help us create these resources and talk about this is I do feel that unless we truly have a context and an understanding ourselves, which we have not gotten,
Right.
arguably we have not gotten that in our education and probably not at home, then I feel that it's important for us to go back and educate ourselves a little bit about where that is coming from and why it's so important.
Right. No, I agree wholeheartedly. I liken it to, attempting to shoot a gun, but you've never shot one before. You don't understand what's about to happen to you, the power of the weapon. It's going to kick back and it could knock you down, and then you don't know where the bullet's going either, right? So, I think it's important, again, to have that knowledge and to be open to listening and learning from others about this work and about this history, that all of this business did not begin with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. There's a long history of systemic racism manifesting in police brutality and police abuse. Long history, centuries old. But I think it's important for folks to understand that, to know that. And then also, again, as I think we discussed maybe our first session, to understand that, again, that systemic racism doesn't just manifest in police actions. It manifests in so many other wides. It's a part of the fabric of this country, and it has been since the very beginning. And our young allies need to understand that as well, that this isn't just new. I would say, so number 3, so if number 1 was knowledge and number 2 would be listening, I'd say number 3 would be for white allies to employ their privilege and their power and their access, and this is regardless of age, to help change this situation. And that is something that white allies, white accomplices can do and should do and do more of. There's one thing to protest in the streets. There's one thing to make a change in the boardroom. It's another whole nother thing to diversify, make sure that the staff of your company or your school or whatever is diverse ethnically, diverse from a sexual orientation standpoint, diverse from a gender basis. Those are the things that really help to go about changing policy. And so while protesting in the streets is great, but going home, going to your school, if you're in K-12, going to your school and saying, where's our diversity and inclusion group? What are we doing to engage in learning and actions and activities that are inclusive of all? How are we going to hold our school accountable for a lack of LGBTQ teachers or not enough Latin Latino or Hispanic male teachers or what have you? How are we going to hold our school accountable for a lack of diversity in the staff, the faculty? Those are policy changes, and those are real things. And those are real things that white allies can do that will really go about making real change. Those aren't performative acts. Marching down the street's a performative act. It's necessary to raise your voices and to gather in mass and do so and fully and firmly support it. But changing policy is what this is about. And that doesn't happen in the street, although the street can help bring about attention to those policy changes.
You spoke about parents going to schools, looking at, or even in their own homes. Do you have, can you point to some resources maybe that if parents see that their school is only being taught from a certain, things are only being taught from a certain perspective, say the land run or, whatever. Mm-hmm. Are there some resources on our list that you could point to that might help parents maybe talk to their schools or their administration or express some of those concerns?
Sure. Yes. Raising race conscious children would be one, which I really like the work. Embrace Race would be one as well. And I really like their work. I like the work of the Conscious Kid as well. And as a journalist myself, I'm really happy about Common Sense Media and the work that they do as well. So that's just a handful of folks who are on our website, and there's so many other resources there. But those are some that come to mind as organizations and that to me, and agencies to me that really stand out in this work. Showing up for racial justice as well, I think, is another good group. But please, I encourage everyone watching to visit the website and TulsaKids.com, and then Dismantling Racism Toolkit resources, and check out what we've compiled here for you to aid you in this work to help develop healthier and more inclusive young people.
Let's talk a little bit. Some of the questions that came up in our past conversations, one was about children and violent images that they're seeing on television, the protests in Oregon. But how do we talk to kids about that and what they're seeing? And I know it varies from age to age, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a big one, right? Because there's no way, unless you just really live under a rock, there's really no way to escape what the racial reckoning that's happening all across this country. And the folks who live under rocks, I'm worried about them already. But it's a great question. In my mind, it's that about sitting down with your children or your child, and explaining to them, and start very basic, depending on their age range, right? About that this happened. So this happened to Rayshard Brooks or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. And I want you to understand that what happened to them was not right. It was not fair to them that they died and that they were killed in these ways. Also, that to help them understand that a part of why they were murdered is because of this thing called racism, and that none of them were armed, none of them posed a threat. Maybe that's the way I put it. None of the three of them or others were in a position to hurt the police officer or hurt anyone. Also, I think it's important to explain that not all police officers are bad people, right? That not all police officers are bad people, depending on the age range. Or you could, on the older level, say not all police officers are racist or have issues with folks of color, but some do. And some may not even believe that they do, but they possess this implicit bias, or they feel more comfortable, right, with folks who look like them, or folks who are also wear their same uniform or uniform like theirs, right? So, but I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations, right? And so to also to help young people understand that there are good people and bad people in every ethnicity, from every country on the planet. There are good people and there are bad people. And just because someone has more melanin than another person, or looks differently than another person, doesn't mean that they're more inherently bad or inherently, less smart, right? Which again goes back to where we started with this idea of Black inequality. That we are all, that no one is, I'm fond of saying, no one is better than anyone else. Some folks are just better off. And to help our young people understand that doesn't, and so with that sort of levels the playing field in terms of this idea of superiority or inferiority. And then talking again further with them about how they understand difference, and what difference, how they respond to difference. And depending on that age, again, that could start with a blue Skittle versus a red Skittle, or for older young people, it could be this music over that music or something else, and start to, again, to help kids understand what implicit bias is, what prejudice is, via very simple rudimentary games, to help them just understand and distinguish difference and prejudice. And I think we have a question, so I'll stop there for now.
A comment, but it goes to what we were talking about with parents and schools. She says, I feel instead of having separate classes for Black history, Latinx history, etc., we should start including all of that in our existing history classes and make history classes more important than they are. I know when I was in school, history was usually taught by coaches.
Yeah.
But I think it goes to your point that you were making earlier, that there is this rich history, and we're missing a lot of the rich history,
yeah,
as we're seeing it through a white lens.
Right. And to the point, I agree with you. Right now, they are taught as electives, African American history or Latin American history or what have you, or taught as electives. I agree with you 100%. That, and when I taught high school history a couple of years ago, I taught what I call real history, which is that you cannot. It is harmful anyway. People do it, so I won't say cannot, but it is harmful to not involve and respect the histories of everyone involved in a moment in history, right? So again, you couldn't have Black Wall Street or the Greenwood District. It did not evolve. It would not have evolved if Blacks hadn't been brought here with the 5 tribes. Some people call them the 5 civilized. I don't like that term civilized because it refers directly to owning Blacks as property. So, but Blacks you can't talk about Black Wall Street, the evolution of Greenwood, if you don't first talk about how Black folks got here in the first place, which was with the Trail of Tears with those 5 nations. You can't talk about Black Wall Street without Jim Crow. Right, which in Oklahoma, Senate Bill number 1, making this the harshest Jim Crow laws in the land, right? So Black Wall Street doesn't happen if the place isn't legislated racism. But then Black Wall Street evolves via the brilliance and resilience of several entrepreneurs who took those land allotments and built from the Civil War and built businesses and homes and property and made this a very economically thriving community in the face of Jim Crow, right? And So, and Jim Crow was legislated by whites. So you can't separate black folks from white folks in this context, or the 5 tribes as well. That's all. And then, of course, the massacre, right? Which is primarily economically jealous white folks coming and burning down this prosperous black neighborhood, because how can you have more than I do? I'm white. How can that happen, right? So all of those histories are interconnected, right? It's not just, we're on the eve of the centennial of the massacre, and it's all our history. If in Tulsa and Oklahoma and in the nation, it's not just a Black history thing. Right. That involves probably almost every major ethnic group in northeastern Oklahoma.
And that little history lesson you just taught involved everybody. Yes. So, and your commenter is saying, yes, history isn't 2 paragraphs about slavery in 6th grade world geography. Right. You're glossing over the genocide of indigenous people. So, yeah, your little 1-minute explanation told more about all the different peoples involved in a historical moment than kids would get in a textbook.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably. I mean, probably, and again, remembering that they're just getting the history of the massacre in the last 4 years, period. Yeah. It was systematically buried. But the idea that the only history we're going to receive, right? And I go back to something that I think we discussed in our first session, right? Because I know I just come off another really great conversation with a group of really brilliant people. And one of the folks on that panel said, if our young people of any ethnicity believe or are taught, right, that the African experience begins with enslavement, then they will believe that Africans or African Americans are worthless, and African Americans will believe it too, right? But our history runs much further, it's much older than being forced on a ship called Jesus, right? And that was actually the name of an actual slave ship, was Jesus, and being brought over to this new world. And again, even if you want to talk about that, thinking about the fact that, well, who were the pilgrims? Who were the first white Europeans on this soil? Folks who were fleeing from prison, or they were considered religious heretics, right? And then what did they come and do? They came and destroyed the folks who were already here. So there's no way to separate our histories and empower one voice. I mean, you can, I shouldn't say no way, but and empower one voice, one perspective, one lens over another, right? Because it's not respectful and it's not accurate. It's not real history.
Well, let's talk a little bit about bias then, about parents, Black parents talking to their children about bias, because you talked about how if you start with slavery, mm-hmm. you're seeing yourself, if you're Black, as probably less than, you're even seeing yourself as a commodity.
Right.
That's a really extreme message to get. Right. A really harmful message. So how do parents talk to their Black children about that kind of bias that they're growing up with?
Yeah, I remember teaching in a school in Sylacauga, Alabama, doing a visiting. I'm sorry?
Sorry, so did you make up that town?
Oh, no, it still exists, I'm sure. Okay. Sylacauga. This is at least 30 years ago. And I remember leaving the school, and, I probably had on probably what most folks would know as MC Hammer pants, but what they're really called are shoga toes. I was a practicing Muslim at the time. I probably had on a kufi and shoga toes, so sort of big pants. And I had just left this school after doing an assembly or something. And a young man asked me about why I was dressed the way that I was dressed. And I told him that, that these are garments and ideas that come from Africa. And the young man said to me, well, I ain't African and I ain't never been no slave. Well, no, you've never been a slave that you know of, right? But you are African. You are from Africa, and your people are from Africa, though you're from Sylacauga, Alabama. But your lineage would take you back there, right? And so I think it's important for the parents of children of color to help to introduce their children and keep their children immersed in their own history, their family histories, and the history of their culture and their ethnicity. I think it's important for those young people again to cast off that narrative, right? That I think I referenced in the article for the magazine, to sort of cast off that narrative, because in Oklahoma, again, it's very easy for anyone to get drunk on that narrative because it's the pervasive narrative in the state of white power, right? Of white privilege. It is the prevailing, because it is dominant culture. It's dominant culture in the US for the most part. And so it's easy for kids to lose themselves and attempt to assimilate and deny their own culture or ethnicities or upbringing in an attempt to assimilate and in an attempt to just survive, really. It's not even just getting along, it's surviving. And for some folks, if their roots and their family roots and culture are not strong and not being consistently presented to these young people, you'll get lost. So those are critical to me, that you're introducing your young people to, if you're fortunate enough to have grandparents alive, that your young people are seeing and learning and listening to their grandparents. They're learning about, you're introducing their culture and their histories to them through books, through media, through what have you. And that so they can see themselves as something other than what mainstream media or whomever tells them they are or that they need to be. And I think that it's important for parents of children of color to also, again, I know our young people last weekend or last Tuesday had a great chat about the talk, right? And so that talk has to happen. And that talk includes how to act if you're stopped by the police, how to act, how to behave if stopped at a grocery store or being followed at a grocery store, how to behave in a variety of scenarios. And it's unfortunate that we have to do that, but it's just real life. It has to happen. And to help them, again, also, same thing, to understand that not all police, not all folks in authority are bad people, but you should also always, I don't know, for lack of a better phrase, have your guard up. Just always have your radar on, and listen to what's around you, what's happening. Use your eyes to see where you are. If you're someplace that seems or feels like it's not a good place to be, leave. And, again, that's also a sad thing to have to say, because not everyone has to experience feeling uncomfortable because of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation.
Or if you're a woman, you can, women
or a woman
have had to deal with the same issues in the same ways, in some ways.
Yeah, or their gender, absolutely.
Yeah. Here's a question. Can you speak to the responsibility and roles of parents and families who have adopted children of color?
Yeah, wow, that's a big one. That's a big question. Well, I think that, and thank you for the question. First of all the things I just said apply in terms of introducing themselves to, or introducing the young people, the children to their culture, right? I will, and I think that's very important particularly in an adopted situation or adoptive situation, that your children feel okay in their own skin, even though their skin doesn't necessarily is the same as your skin as parents. They need to feel they need to feel empowered. They need to feel okay. And particularly if, and I'm assuming that the parent who asked that question is white, I'm not sure, but if the parent is a white parent, or just let's just say not the same ethnicity as the children of color, it's really important that you consistently introduce ways for them to learn how to love themselves and love the skin that they're in, because they're already dealing with the trauma of their biological parents not being present for whatever reasons, right? And so I've seen it so many times. It's very easy for adopted children or wards of the state, particularly of color, who've been adopted by folks who are not of the same ethnicity, to devalue their own sense of self. And again, that huge hurdle of getting over where are my biological parents is something that some folks are traumatized by for life. But one of the things that's very important that you do, in my opinion, is make sure that you're introducing them to their culture. Make sure that you're giving them positive messages, and reinforcing those positive messages about the skin they're in always, consistently. I know of a young white woman whom had children with a Black man, and that Black man is no longer in their lives, and the young woman chose to raise her children without any recognition whatsoever that their father is Black, and those children are going to be lost. I believe that they're going to struggle in ways that were not necessary if their mother simply, I won't say simply because it's not simple, but if their mother had been able to overcome her pain or work through her pain of the marriage or the relationship not working out, to be able to see those children as Black, and teach them what it is, how to love themselves. And so they're going to grow up only loving part of themselves. They're going to grow up loving half of themselves and not their whole selves. And they're going to struggle. And I hate to say that, but they're going to struggle. So it's just very important that to overcome that where are my parents question, where are my biological parents question, that you consistently introduce positive images and messaging of what it is to be in their skin. And it has to be consistent, and show them an awful lot of love, which I'm sure you do as an adoptive parent, because you wouldn't do it otherwise. So those would be the two main things, but that immersing them in their culture has to be consistent. It's not a buy a book today and be done for a month or whatever. It's got to be every day.
Yeah. And I think as parents, we make choices of who we associate with, who our friends are, who we're including in our lives, and what books we're buying for our children, and what shows we're watching on TV. So all of that is immersive in whatever kind of culture that we choose to bring to our children.
Yeah, drive across town and put them in a soccer club with largely, young people of color. Get them engaged and have them engage in social activities with kids who look like them. It might cost you some gas money, but it's worth it in the long run.
Yeah,
right?
You can, as a parent, choose to find those things.
Right.
Here's another question. Our school district refuses to engage with communities, parents, and families. Offers of engagement with scholars from the community and experts in their field, members of living cultures, are consistently dismissed for outside consultants. At the same time, the board will vote against the will of the communities. There is little equity in saying, we know what's best for your children and your community, so we're going to do this anyway. How can we communicate to policymakers that what they think is the performance of equity is actually a demonstration many times of white supremacy? So it sounds like decisions are being made maybe without listening.
Mm-hmm.
You started talking about listening, and it sounds like someone's feeling left out of the conversation.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
What comes to mind immediately, I think maybe something that we discussed in our first session as well, which is that there's power in parents. There's power in a group of committed and concerned parents, concerned adults, coming together, writing down their concerns or what have you, and being consistent in terms of sharing those concerns at the school board, at the city council, or wherever, with the president, with the superintendent, or the principal, I should say, or the superintendent, or whatever it is. But I think that your strength is in numbers. If there is a large group of parents, and maybe there are some you don't know because maybe you haven't asked yet, but assemble as many as possible who share your concerns, and then create your manifesto or your platform or the issues that you want to raise. And then again, that also will require daily knocking on the door. That's also got to be consistent as well. And the more you knock on the door, the more you'll get some media attention perhaps, but more than anything, it'll get around, and more parents and more folks will join the cause. And the strengths are in the numbers. So you as a block have power, but even you as an individual parent have power too, in terms of what you will or will not accept, what you can or cannot do. But if you have 100 parents involved, if you all decide that you're going to not fund something, or you're all going to boycott this fundraiser for the school or whatever. I mean, on the one hand, it could hurt the kids, but on the other hand, you'll choose wisely whatever it is, your action that you explore, so you're not hurting your kids. But what it is about is making sure that those in power who need to hear you with this wide union of forces and voices. Because the strength there is in those numbers, and then you all can do things. You can make change. I have a friend who is a good friend who's a teacher at a school, who raised a concern to admin about returning to school in this pandemic. And then he decided, I'm going to conduct a survey of all of his colleagues at this school to see how they feel about returning to school in the pandemic. And many of the teachers and staff agreed with his concerns, and they all signed this petition. And then this petition was presented to the school admin, and one of the school administrators said, well, why didn't you just come to me by yourself? Why did you have to make everyone aware of this? Yeah. And so what he did was effective, right? One-on-one, she might have found some way to finesse him or something. But when 100 faculty and staff have signed this thing that says we are concerned about this, the administration had to listen. They had to do something. They had to respond. So I hope that's helpful.
Well, Quraysh, that reminds me of, #MeToo movement. If someone speaks up, there may be 100 other people who are feeling the same way, but maybe it takes somebody to start the conversation or to bring that to the forefront, as you were saying. So, So trying to organize a group of people who have the same concerns can be very effective. Thank you. We only have a couple more minutes. We haven't really gotten to talking to children or about violence. I mean, I don't know that, you know, I was struck, I guess, last week when we talked with the teens, which was such an amazing conversation. I hope people will go back and listen to those young people. I was struck by the young Black woman whose brother had just gotten a driver's license, and every time he leaves alone, she wants to go with him because
Right.
she's afraid for him to be a Black young person alone.
Right.
And living with that kind of fear as a you know, teenager, I can't even imagine. But how do you talk about that? Because that's about violence. It's about impending violence. It's about fear. It's about bias. You were talking about police officers. They may not even be aware of their own biases. Many of us are not aware of our own biases.
That's correct. Yeah, it is about implicit bias, and it's also about, like I mentioned before, when I was quoting from Dr. Taylor's book about how, again, Darren Wilson didn't know that Michael Brown was accused of anything when he killed him, you know, or alleged that he had done anything, any criminal activity when he killed him. But as soon as that criminal activity was made public, which was stealing a couple of cigars, it was justification for the murder of Michael Brown. And I think that when Alex's brother leaves the house, you know, he's thinking about, you know, driving safely and you know, making sure he turns his blinkers on and what have you. But also in the back of his head, he's thinking about what if I get stopped? What could happen to me, and making sure that I know how to respond to that. And again, we are primarily young men, but also young women of color are often considered suspect just because we are folks of color. And so that implicit bias provides fodder for those of us in the skin to always be guarded, to always be aware, to always, you know. And again, I lived in Chicago for 28 years. I had a swivel. I still have a swivel in my head, right? I'm always able to look around, and I'm always surveying my surroundings. And that is an unfortunate thing to have to do, but it's a necessary thing to for, I think, for folks of color, for women as well, to have to learn to do, to always be aware of where you are, always be aware of your surroundings. And unfortunately, this society and this culture demands that we do, or we'll become somebody's victim. And again, for folks of color, particularly young men, again, that bias that's hundreds of years old suggests that we're already guilty of something. Like, I was born guilty, right? And, you know, unless we can engage and continue to engage in this work, right? That having the difficult conversations, not only with young people, but also with adults, you know, who are really making these policy decisions right now, to engage and be able to engage in these difficult conversations, right? Because nothing will change if we don't engage in these conversations. They are often challenging, but they have to happen. But most of us would rather just ignore them and go on about our happy, blissful lives and not engage in the conversation. And so nothing will change, right? Until we really do, until we really take that seriously.
But if you're Black, you have to think about, like the young man in the back of your head, you have to think always of you may become that victim, whereas a white person really doesn't have to do that.
That's correct.
to keep engaging in these conversations.
Yeah.
And, which, thank you for this nice comment from someone. Thank you for answering our question. Extend the series. I always feel there's so much more to discuss, which goes to our resources. We're at the end of our time, and I hope that everyone will look at the TulsaKids website and look at our toolkit for racism tools and resources, because I hope, go to your PTAs. I know, we don't have the advantage of being able to gather anymore for a while, but, start reading these resources and think, how can we change? How can we change in our family? How can we change in our neighborhood? How can we change in our schools? So start with the resources while you're in this pandemic mode of seclusion. Read some things, educate yourselves. We'll all educate ourselves, and maybe we can go out and make things better, and make some of these changes that Quraysh was talking about, that we talked about in this series. I hope so. So I want to thank you. You were amazing, Quraysh. I have so enjoyed these discussions, and thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Maybe we do need to extend it, but we'll talk about that offline.
Maybe we should. Maybe we need to do a whole monthly series, but I would love to do that. Because there are so many things to discuss and so many questions that people have. And thank you to OSU-Tulsa. I loved working with you guys, and Alicia and Aaron, you were wonderful, and the Tri-City Collective. And I feel like there's so many resources just in our community if we can just get together and talk. And I thank all of our viewers, and make sure you share these the Facebook Live series with your friends. Educate everybody. So thank you, and have a wonderful day.